Chapter 4 Misconceptions Part 2 May knew the building's layout, so I allowed her to lead the way. We walked around the outermost hall of the ground floor, taking care not to disturb any of the dead ponies. Some of them were burnt worse than others, with a hoofful having burned down with to their skeletons. We reached the stairwell, which was thankfully intact. Next to it was an elevator which had been clearly in transit when the building was destroyed. The doors had been slammed open by the impact of a carriage, which lay crumpled just below the frame. The snapped cable lay coiled on top of the heap. Gizmo still probably could have fixed it, nickered May. I gave a weak smile. The stairs were sturdy enough to hold both of us, though, although raining debris from above had punched a few holes in the staircase. When we reached the third floor, we discovered that the stairs had collapsed entirely, blocking any further ascent. Part of the floor above had come with them, and we squeezed under it to get through the hallway. More rubble blocked one branch of the hall, but May proceeded down the other path. Although the ceiling groaned, the debris had settled enough that we could avoid further collapse, so long we didn't start buckling the walls down. At the end of the hall, or at least the middle of the hall, before the other half of the building had been crushed, was May's office. The door lay splayed off its hinges, and the window was shattered. May nudged it aside, causing it to fall right off the frame. She shrugged and proceeded inside. It was furnished with a desk and several cabinets, a pink and yellow metal box marked with a butterfly, and a small lab set up in one corner. May glanced at the small chemistry set contemplatively. I suppose a quick look couldn't hurt. Without stopping to explain, May walked over to the lab table. She magically pulled a microscope towards her, as well as a pair of tweezers and some glass plates. Using the tweezers, she plucked a piece of her rotten skin from one of her forelegs. She then placed it carefully between the glass plates, then slipped it underneath the lens of a microscope. I watched silently as she twiddled the knobs of the microscope for a few minutes, occasionally murmuring, "I see," and She looked up from the microscope and let out a sigh, turning back to face me. "Nothing I had really guessed already," she claimed. I can only assume that she was talking about our condition. Obviously, a mutation caused by extreme radiation exposure, but I'd need better equipment to delve into it further. Maybe the MAS ponies would be happy we brought them supplies that they let you use theirs, I suggested, suggested a bit dubiously. May still gave a small smile in return. She left the microscope where it was and moved over to her desk. She pulled open a few drawers, levitating their contents out into her saddlebag. 2 healing potions, a bottle of pills, 3 inhalers, and a few syringes. She pulled out a key hanging on a chain, which she hung around her neck. Lastly, she pulled out a coin sack, shaking it gingerly. She looked like she was about to abandon it, but shrugged, and slipped it into her bag as well. "Do you plan on bribing the MAS ponies if all else fails?" I asked wearily. "Not unless they take bottle caps," replied May, with a bemused snort. "I collect them as a hobby in a little spare time I had. I figured it wouldn't hurt to hang on to these for a bit of sentiment." I nodded, smiling slightly. May moved over to the medical box and opened it, pulling out 4 more healing potions, a couple of packets of Radaway, and a few more syringes. We left her office and proceeded through each room left intact on the 3rd floor, retrieving what we could from the medical boxes contained within them. We repeated the process for the patient's room on the 2nd floor. May stopped in each room for a moment and pulled the blankets overhead for any pony who had died in their bed. If they had been asleep when the bombs went off, that would have been a small mercy. By the time we returned to the ground floor, May's pack were loaded with plenty of medical supplies, including some braces, ointments, and a large quantity of magic-laced bandages. That still left the problem of food. Thankfully, the cafeteria had also been spared by the collapse, and was largely free of corpses. This probably owed to the fact that the bomb had gone off after the breakfast hour had finished. There were a number of fridges and pantries, despite their charred exteriors, were ripe for the picking. Before I entered the cafeteria kitchen, May held a hoof in front of me. There's something alive in here." She glanced at what happened to be a large walk-in cooler. She was staring at it rather intently, even though the door was shut tight. "How can there be something alive?" I demanded, perhaps a bit louder than I should have, considering there might be something hostile nearby. "There might not be," said May. She held her pip buck up to me. This thing had a feature that detected nearby life forms and determined if it was hostile or not. However, I'm not sure it's working properly. Why is that? It should have been able to pick up anything living from further away than this, noted May. She let out an angry sigh. There is more. There is more. Also, the health monitor on this thing hasn't been registering my vitals since a few days ago. It seems to think I'm deceased. That was strange. Maybe the mutation's confusing it. I suggested, though May was probably already had a better idea of her own. Maybe, said May, just going along with it for what I said for now. Leaving the topic alone, she stepped cautiously towards the large cooler. From a few feet away, she pulled the door open with her magic, allowing the light from her horn to cast inside. From where I was standing, I could see another corpse within the large fridge. Apparently it had been sealed inside when the megaspell detonated. It looked strangely rotten for a corpse that had been preserved in a cooler. May and I jumped back in full yard when the corpse shifted, rising to its hooves slowly. It was a zombie pony! Wait, I checked myself. Not a zombie. Some pony like May and I, mutated by the radiation, but not killed by the exposure. Perhaps being in a fridge all that time of the blast had provided a little bit of extra protection. The not a zombie shambled towards us slowly, its gait stiffened by the lingering cold of the fridge. May stepped forward, raising her hoof towards the other pony. Are you all right? She asked. The pony did not respond, simply continuing to trot slowly towards us. It raised its no. His head slightly stared vacantly at the two of us. He stopped, looking back and forth between the two of us, his tongue slipping out of his muzzle. A low, unintelligible, gurgling noise escaped from his throat. Despite the same physical condition as May and me, this pony seemed to be lacking in mental wellness. Perhaps he had suffered brain damage from the lack of fresh air? Before we can explore the possibility of helping this poor buck, he let out an equine growl before breaking into a charge towards us. He was still slow and stiff by his stiff limbs, giving May and I a chance to duck out of the way easily. The mutated buck, unable to turn swiftly, collided headlong into a pantry just behind where we had been standing, breaking the doors off when he collided with it. He staggered backwards, bits of broken wood stabbing into his face. The collision with the pantry did not seem to faze the zombie pony. As it turned back towards us, slavering mindlessly, May pulled that gun out of its holster, pointing at him. Stay right where you are, she ordered. I don't want to have to use this. The zombie paid her no heed and charged at her again. May grimaced, and I heard a clicking sound coming up from the gun. Shit, she called, rolling out of the way. The charging buck. She never reloaded the weapon. May's horn lit up, pulling open one of the pouches on the holster, Spandoiler, and removing the cylinder of fresh bullets from it. The chamber of the gun had sprung open forcibly, ejecting the empty casings from within. Before May and I could slip new ammunition, Zombie Buck pounced on her again, causing her magic to falter, dropping the gun and bullets alike. She let out a high-pitched scream of pain as he bit into her shoulder savagely. Dark blood oozed from the wound, mixing with the foam from his mouth. I had to act quickly, or the zombie stallion would tear May's leg clean off. I ran up from behind, intending to pry him loose, but was met with a strong rear hoof kick. The force of the kick threw me against the nearby counter, knocking the cutting board and knife to the floor with a clatter. I rubbed the back of my head gingerly, already feeling a lump forming. I spat out a tooth that the kick had knocked loose. A pained whinny from May jerked my attention back to the zombie pony, trying to make a snack out of her. Acting instinctively, I grabbed the handle of the knife that had fallen on the floor within my teeth. The blade was still fairly sharp. I jumped into the air, gliding above the reach of the buck's hind hooves, and dropped it onto him forcefully, directly above. The impact wrenching his teeth free of May's shoulder. Without hesitating, I drove the knife in his mouth, straight through the top of his head. It penetrated his skull with sickening ease, and a squishy, crunching noise signaled the end of the zombie buck. The buck screamed awfully and thrashed, bucking me off of its back. I landed roughly near the same counter, watching as the buck collapsed into a twitching heap, falling still after a few moments. What I had done barely registered as I flew over to May's side. prompting her against the nearby cabinet. The wound in her shoulder was ugly, and I quickly dove into her saddlebags for a healing potion. At least we weren't short on them this time. May's shoulder began to knit itself back together as the healing potion took effect. The same faint green glow that had been around the gunshot wound could be seen supplementing the potion's magic. May's grunting as the potion finished its work, then gingerly got back upright. She winced as she moved her shoulder, pulling a hoof off the floor to keep it from its weight off of it. Her horn glowed as she rolled her shoulder, mending its sprain caused by the zombie pony's initial pounce. Once she was finished tending to herself, May glanced at the now lifeless corpse of the buck that tried to eat her. "Did you—" She began, stopping without looking for confirmation. At her words, I began to stare at the cadaver. I had killed somebody. A strange sensation washed over me. I had kept myself away from the war specifically because I didn't want to hurt anyone. But now I just done that. Not even an enemy of Equestria. I just killed a fellow pony. True, he was a savage, voracious, and probably deranged, but he had still either been a Ministry of Peace employee or a patient. I shuddered coldly. I had to seat myself to catch my breath. I hadn't realized I'd been panting so harshly. May walked up to the buck, his dead eyes staring blankly at her. She magically removed the knife from his skull and then closed his eyelids. She bowed her head over him and then turned to face me. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure I wanted to be thanked for that." I'm sure he was suffering, and there wasn't anything I could have done for him under the circumstances. It didn't make me feel too much better. Now, let's see what we can find. I was glad to move on to opening the cupboards, pantries, and fridges, taking my mind away from the dead zombie buck. I didn't want to start thinking about who he had been or how he had gotten trapped in the fridge. I wanted to focus on what we had come here for, and the still living ponies who were counting on us. The cafeteria yielded an excellent amount of canned, boxed, or otherwise preserved food, enough to last the MAS ponies in the building a good while, so long as they rationed it. Unfortunately, it was all tainted with magical radiation, and made May's pit bug click alarmingly. Over the week and a half since the megaspell detonation, the radiation had settled into unprotected buildings, bleeding into the food. The contents of the cooler were slightly better, having been sealed away, but not by much. Thankfully, it seemed that the Ministry of Peace had been prepared for such a possibility. May produced a talisman that she found on the second floor, which she claimed could be used to purge small amounts of magical radiation. According to her, it contained the same spell that formed the basis of the Radaway potion. Considering the amount of food we had gathered, we would only be able to purge the stockpile once. This opened several new problems. As soon as the purging spell was finished, the radiation would start to seep into the food again. With the radiation as concentrated as it was, it wouldn't take all that long. On top of that, transporting the food back to the Ministry of Arcane Science Hub would be a daunting task. May's telekinesis was sufficient to lift about half of what we had gathered at the time, but it would leave it unshielded against the magical radiation. Maintaining her radiation ward and telekinesis together, we could cut the mass she could carry to 1/4 of what we could have before. This effectively meant that we would have to make 8 trips through the streets of Manhattan. Not only would that mean the ridiculous amount of time, but there were still the threats that could derail us further, such as that mutant balefire-breathing phoenix. Not only that, but the food we left behind on each trip was absorbing radiation again. I wasn't sure I trusted the stability of the building either. "Too bad we don't have a wagon," muttered May, staring at the food we had gathered. I groaned, falling to my haunches. I winced as I sat on the part of my leg that had been shot. "Wait, that's it. I think I might have something that'll work." I reminded her that the overturned cart that we had ducked behind when the guard pony shot at us. "That could work," remarked May with a smile. "How do you plan on getting it here, though?" I smirked coyly and fluttered my featherless wings at her. "Oh, yeah." Before heading back to pick up the cart, I helped May move the supplies onto the street. I didn't want them being lost if the building should collapse while I was gone. We piled them neatly in the middle of the street, then I turned and took off. I flew up relishing the chance to be back in the air. It helped that I knew the city much better from above, and would be able to get the cart and back quickly. As I passed over May, my lazy eye rolled downward, catching a glimpse of her. She was levitating something out of her saddlebag and bringing it to her mouth. It's hard to tell from this distance, but it looked like one of the inhalers she had taken from the office. She took a deep breath with the canister in her mouth. I presumed it was some sort of aerosol asthma medication. Did you think it would help with the roughness of our throats? Making a note to ask her about it when I got back, I flew off towards the Ministry of Arcane Science hub. I managed to reach the tower after only 10 minutes. The air was really the only way to travel, though I wish I could convince May of that. I circled around the building, avoiding the balcony where the guards had been. I sat down beneath the monorail track on the far side. From there, I trotted over the overturned cart. It took a bit of straining, but I managed to get it back upright. I moved around to the front of the cart, intending to strap myself in. Unfortunately, the harness was in tatters. Half of it was burnt off. I wasn't about to let something like that stop me. Using the straps of my own saddlebags and used a bit of patchwork, I was able to fashion something that would hold together well enough to pull the cart. Hopefully, I would be able to take the added weight of May and the food. I didn't really have anything better at my disposal. I pulled the cart along the ground to test the harnesses first. It was a bit tricky, as one of the wheels was missing, causing the axle to scrape along the ground noisily. Still, the makeshift harness held up, and the missing wheel wouldn't be a problem once in the air. Once I had passed back under the monorail, I took off, putting the tower behind me. It took me a little longer to get back to the hospital, with the cart dragging behind me. But I did so without incident. I landed in the street, coming to a stop in front of May, who was laying in the middle of the road next to the pile of food. She had a strange, spaced-out look about her. Her pupils were dilated, and she wore an awkward smile. She barely seemed to notice I had returned. "Looky what I found," I announced jovially. May blinked and then shook her head, her attention focusing back on me. "Nice work," he said, sounding a little weary. Her voice sounded coarse. So apparently the inhaler hadn't helped answering my question before I had to ask it. I smiled at her and nodded towards the pile of food. Mind putting those onto the cart? I'd had to take this jury-rigged harness apart to get it out right now. Sure thing. May's horn lit up as she magically lifted the boxes and cans onto the cart, a few stacks at a time. Once that she had loaded all of them, she climbed onto the cart herself and produced the radiation-purging talisman. I looked back and watched as the talisman lit up, promptly by May. The pile of food glowed with a soft green light that seeped off it into the talisman. When the process was finished, the talisman sparked and died, causing May to toss it aside. Immediately after discarding the talisman, May cast her magical radiation ward around the cart entirely. The clicking noise of her pit butt quieted it, and as the magical radiation was repelled. Without further delay, I began to pull against the harness of the cart, not wanting to keep the ponies in the MAS hub waiting any longer. We were in the air in less than a minute, May's concentration on the ward thankfully keeping her from collapsing. We reached the MAS hub for the final time earlier in the evening. I deliberately hauled the cart out in front of the tower to show the two guard ponies what we had brought for them, only to not see them. Instead, there was only one guard, and he looked a bit smaller than the two who had been there during the day. He aimed the rifle at us, just as they had. But at least he didn't start shooting right away. From this close, I could see his face clearly through the domed helmet of the hazmat suit. He looked confused. "Hey there!" I called out to him. "Special delivery for the ponies at the MAS Manhattan hub." The young bug gawked at me. Apparently, the preceding guards had not bothered to inform him that they had sent to find food and medical supplies. I set the cart down by the main entrance, keeping both my eyes fixed on the guard, just in case. I detached myself from the harness and flew up to the balcony. The younger guard seemed a bit startled when I landed next to him, but more than a little curious. "You're one of those zombie ponies the turntable was talking about," stated the colt bluntly. I face-huffed. "We needed a new title," I muttered. not wanting to associate myself with the cannibalistic buck that I had actually labeled as a zombie pony in my own mind. That's not the important thing, though. We've got food and medicine for you here at the hub. The guards I were earlier told us you were in need of them. The hazmat Colt looked at me like I was crazy. I think they might have been just trying to get rid of you. What? This place was actually designed to be a fail-safe megaspell shelter. We've got food enough here to last us a good while. Seeing the growing look of the irritation on my face, he quickly added, "Note that your gift is not that your gift is unwelcomed. In fact, we are in need a fair amount of medicine. Even though we patched the holes in our magical defense, there's still a few ponies suffering from radiation poisoning. Not to mention those that were injured when parts of the tower were damaged. Plus, the food will make the rationing less arduous." I was only slightly relieved and a bit miffed to the two jerk guards for sending us on a wild griffin chase. Well, I'm glad this wasn't a complete waste. Now then, my companion and I are in need of rest. We also have some news to give to Turntable about Canterlot and a few of other settlements. The guard grimaced. "I don't think I can allow that." He held up a four-legged the pit-buck built into the suit, which went clickety-click as he waved it over me. "With the amount of radiation you're giving off, I'm surprised you're not glowing. Our decontamination only isn't sufficient to clean you up enough to safely enter the tower. If we let you in, everybody else might be at risk." I felt like there was a vice around my heart. I did not regret gathering the supplies, but it ached from the inside knowing that the presence might be health hazardous to other ponies. I looked sternly at the guard colt, although my eyes wandered again, making it look a little comical. "All right, but I can trust you to relay our information to Turntable. It's really important." The colt nodded. "Absolutely. It's the least I can do." After relaying the information we had for Turntable to the young guard, I returned to May with instructions for him. I pulled the cart, which May was still keeping shielded from the outside radiation, around to the rear of the building, where a loading dock was occupied by a slew of large, battered wagons. I shoved the cart into an empty bay, and was surprised to see the two guards from earlier coming out of their hazmat suits to take the food and medicine inside. They just seemed surprised that we had delivered it in the first place. May kept a small smattering of the medical supplies for our own use, just in case we had any more strange encounters on the way back to Ponyville. As well, I kept a bit of food for us, but not much, considering that we need to seem to be able to go longer without it. I hoped that we would be able to purge the excess radiation we had absorbed by the time we got back to Ponyville, otherwise we wouldn't be able to stay there. May and I spent the night in the empty building across the street from the MAS hub. The ordeal of the day had left us fatigued, and made the sleep we got far more wonderful than I thought since the megaspell. I was relieved that my sleep came without nightmares for the first time in a week and a half. May was less fortunate, as memories of the mangled corpse filled her night with terrors. I thought I heard her cry out Buttercup's name once or twice. We awoke early the following morning, and following a small breakfast, proceeded to depart from Manhattan. We took the trip slowly, not wanting to overexert ourselves after the previous day's events. Thankfully, the city seemed willing to let us go without incident. Better still, once we were outside the city limits, the radiation therein no longer saturated us. The radiation levels of our own body began slowly bleeding off. As we passed through Fetlock, May smiled softly, knowing that Gizmo, that somewhere out there, her brother and nephew were safe inside Stable 29. She switched on to Turntable's broadcast, wanting to make sure the news had gotten through as well. "Good morning, everybody. I hope you all slept well. Now put on your listening ears, because I got some news for you. Remember how yesterday I was talking about those zombie ponies that have been spotted in the vicinity of Manhattan? Well, it turns out, not only are they crazed and diseased or undead, they're also quite generous." I went to remember the actual zombie pony from the hospital, hopefully he was the unique case. A pair of these ponies braved the Manhattan ruins yesterday to gather food and medical supplies, which they graciously donated to us here at the MAS hub. Along with those supplies, they had news from us outside the city. Now, unfortunately, things getting a little heartbreaking here. Those two came all the way here from Ponyville, where they got a glimpse of our fort and capital of Canterlot. Sadly, a particularly nasty zebra megaspell wiped out the city. There's a bit of hope, as our Stable Tech engineer friend yesterday told us that Stable 1, which is located in Canterlot, was among those who successfully sealed. My prayers go out to the princesses, for whom the stable was primarily intended. Since I don't want to leave you there on a sour note, I've got one last piece of news. Also, thanks to the not zombie ponies, as I mentioned, that came here from Ponyville, which they claimed is largely intact and very empty due to most of the population being relocated to a nearby stable. If you can make the trip and need some place to stay that's not glowing with radiation, it'd be worth your while to head that way. As well as the small outlying settlement of Appaloosa has been confirmed as a relatively safe haven by some other sources. It seems that small towns are the place to be right now, and that's the truth of the matter. Footnote: Status update. Current status: Ghoul, moderately irradiated. Lucidity, high. Bonus perk added. Like a buck to the face, rank 1. We really like Sparkle Cola Rad, as well as trace amounts of radiation contained within are beneficial to your ghoul's physiology. In addition to the regular effect, the consumption of Sparkle Cola Rad grants temporarily +1 to agility. This has been Followed Equestria, Ditzy Doo Chronicles, Chapter 4, Misconceptions Part 2. Thank you for listening.